11 p.m. at Oak Creek Memorial Hospital in Savannah, and the night shift moved like a ghost through fluorescent-lit corridors. Natalie Hayes stood before her locker in the staff room, hands trembling slightly as she withdrew a faded patch of cloth no larger than her palm. The unit insignia was barely visible now, desert tan faded to the color of old bone, edges frayed from handling. She'd performed this ritual every shift for 6 months. Unfold. Look. Remember. Fold. Lock away. Repeat. Her knuckles bore scars that told their own story if anyone had bothered to look, rope burns shaped like the equipment harness she'd worn rappelling into places that no longer existed in classified files. The burns had healed unevenly, creating a topography of white tissue across her skin like a map of places she'd been ordered to forget. She traced one scar with her opposite thumb, the muscle memory of that motion as automatic as breathing, then secured the patch inside the locker's back panel where it stayed hidden behind the spare scrubs and the lunch container she never quite finished. The metal door swung shut with a soft click that sounded like a pistol hammer falling on an empty chamber. The emergency department sprawled across 4,000 square feet of controlled chaos held in check only by protocol and coffee. Natalie moved through it with an economy of motion that most night shift nurses never developed. Her feet fell in precise patterns, not the shuffling exhaustion of someone who'd worked doubles, but the deliberate footfalls of a person who understood spatial awareness the way musicians understood time signatures. Right angle at the trauma bay entrance. 3 steps to the supply station. Avoid the intersection where the orthopedic cart jutted into the corridor. She'd mapped Oak Creek's layout the way soldiers mapped minefields, not paranoia, just ancient habit encoded so deep that conscious thought never touched it. Her badge, clipped to her scrub pocket, displayed the word nurse in block letters. That was the name the hospital knew her by. That was the name her paychecks carried. That was the only truth anyone needed. The night shift had been mercifully quiet for the past hour. 2 trauma patients in Bay 3 and 5, both stable and sleeping off their respective injuries. A diabetic with elevated glucose levels in the waiting room, clipboard in hand, resigned to the long wait that came with non-emergent cases. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their constant hum, a sound like insects trapped in the ceiling panels, and Natalie restocked the anesthesia cart with the methodical precision of someone performing a deeply familiar ritual. Syringes. Medications. Equipment arranged exactly as protocol demanded, nothing more, nothing less. She did not make conversation. She did not make eye contact with the physicians or the residents who passed her station. She existed in the clean space between visibility and invisibility, visible enough to do her job, invisible enough to move through rooms without disrupting the hierarchies that mattered in places like this. A nurse was infrastructure. Necessary but unremarkable, like the ventilation system or the backup generator. Dr. Richard Hargrove stood in the physician's lounge, coffee in hand, watching her work through the observation window that ran along the trauma bay corridor. He was 53 years old and carried his authority like a man wearing expensive cologne, everyone around him aware of it whether they wanted to be or not. His Rolex caught the light when he lifted his cup, and his suit cost more than most nurses made in a month. He'd been chief of emergency medicine at Oak Creek for 8 years, and in that time he'd learned the precise leverage points of institutional power. He knew which board members played golf on Tuesday mornings. He knew which insurance executives owed him favors. He knew exactly how many complaints a well-connected physician could ignore before the hospital had to take action. But he did not yet know who Natalie Hayes was. He only saw a woman in navy scrubs, mid-30s or early 40s, moving through the ER with unusual grace, restocking trauma bays. He made a mental note of her presence, not attraction, but notation. The way a predator notices movement in tall grass. It was 11:41 p.m. when the resident, Dr. Chen, approached Natalie with a medication order for the patient in Bay 3. The order was written on a chart that would later become important, though neither of them knew it yet. Dr. Chen was 28, 5 years out of medical school, still operating under the assumption that physicians were infallible. He handed her the chart without looking up from his phone. "Administer 500 units of heparin, for push," he said. The words came with the flat tone of someone reading instructions off a screen. Natalie took the chart. She did not argue. She did not question the order aloud. Instead, she walked directly to the medication dispensary and cross-referenced the order against the patient's age, weight, and current medication list. The patient was 72 years old. The standard heparin dosage for a patient of that age and weight with the listed comorbidities should not exceed 300 units. The order was written 3 times the safe threshold. Her jaw tightened. Almost imperceptibly. She pulled up the dosage chart on the computer, documented the discrepancy, and then, this was the critical part, she walked back to the physician's lounge where Dr. Hargrove was now reviewing charts with an intern, a young man who looked like he hadn't slept in 36 hours. Dr. Chen's order for Bay 3, Natalie said. Her voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that came from years of not being heard. The heparin dose appears to be 3 times the standard threshold for this patient's weight and medical history. She was not requesting permission to correct it. She was not asking for his approval. She was stating a fact. A medical fact. The kind of fact that, if ignored, could stop a heart. The intern's eyes widened slightly. The pen in Dr. Hargrove's hand went still. He turned to face her with the expression of a man who'd just discovered a small scratch on an expensive car, irritation mixed with an unwillingness to acknowledge the damage. His jaw worked silently for perhaps 2 seconds. Then he looked away, back at the chart in front of him. Run it by Dr. Chen again, he said flatly. He can make the call. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no. It was the kind of non-response that powerful men gave when they were being corrected and didn't want to admit it. Natalie turned and walked back to the medication dispensary without waiting for further acknowledgement. The intern stared at Dr. Hargrove, who did not make eye contact. Instead, Hargrove set down his pen with deliberate care and pulled out his phone. He turned slightly, angling away from the other physicians in the lounge, and made a call. The voice on the other end answered on the second ring. His words came out in the kind of low tone reserved for conversations meant to be private. I want everything on Hayes, he said. Personnel file. Background check. Every shift she's worked in the past 6 months. And I want to know how a night shift nurse thinks she has the authority to correct a resident's orders in front of other staff. He paused, listening. No, I don't know where she came from yet. Find out. He hung up. His hand released the phone slowly, and he sat back in his chair, fingers steepled, thinking the kind of thoughts that men like him thought when someone had crossed an invisible line they hadn't known existed. She was a problem now. Possibly. Or possibly an opportunity to make an example. He would need to think about which. The rest of the night shift passed in the way night shifts passed in emergency medicine, long stretches of quiet broken by sudden violence. A woman arrived via ambulance at 1:15 a.m. with acute appendicitis. A teenager was brought in by parents at 2:43 a.m. with a broken arm and a concussion from a skateboard accident. Natalie attended to both with the same invisible competence, the same quiet efficiency, the same absence of self that had carried her through 6 months of anonymity at Oak Creek Memorial. She moved through the hospital the way smoke moves through an open room, present but not obstinate, going wherever the air currents pushed her, never forcing her way into spaces that didn't want her. By 5:27 a.m., when the day shift began trickling in and the night shift prepared to hand off their patients, Natalie had already documented 3 medication orders, placed 2 full lines, assessed and reassessed vital signs on 5 different patients, and made exactly 0 mistakes. The kind of shift that in her previous life would have generated medals. In this life, it generated nothing but the knowledge that she would return tomorrow evening at 11 p.m. and do it again. She clocked out at 7 a.m., walked through the automatic doors into morning sunshine that felt like an accusation, and drove to her apartment that had no photographs on the walls. Behind her, in the physician's lounge, Dr. Hargrove was pulling up an encrypted email on his personal laptop, reading the first parts of a background check that would tell him things he thought he wanted to know, and very carefully avoiding the things he wasn't yet prepared to understand. The physician's lounge at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness of a room where the same 6 people had been cycling through 12-hour shifts for 3 years straight. Dr. Hargrove sat in the corner leather chair, the one reserved for attendings, with his feet propped on the ottoman, reviewing something on his laptop with the expression of a man holding a winning lottery ticket. It was 6:16 a.m. The morning shift was filtering in, Dr. Chen grabbing a styrofoam cup, Dr. Rodriguez scanning the schedule board, 3 residents and a pair of nurses waiting for the daily huddle to begin. Hargrove closed his laptop slowly. Deliberately. He glanced up, making sure he had an audience. "Gentlemen," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. His voice carried the casual confidence of someone who'd never been questioned in his life. "I'm giving Hayes 1 week. Maybe less. By Friday, she'll quit. $20 says she's gone before her next weekend rotation." He smiled, the kind of smile that had been working for him since medical school, the kind that made other men lean in and become complicit. "Any takers?" Laughter. Genuine laughter. Dr. Chen snorted into his coffee. Rodriguez grinned. One of the residents, a kid who couldn't have been more than 26, said, "She'll make it 2 weeks just to spite you, sir." "No," Hargrove said with absolute certainty. "She's already running on fumes. One more push and she breaks. I can see it." He couldn't, of course. He was looking at a woman he decided to hate for the unforgivable crime of being right in front of a junior doctor. But Hargrove had built a career on confidence, and confidence, he'd learned long ago, was indistinguishable from truth if you said it loud enough and often enough. The lounge door opened. Natalie Hayes stood in the doorway with a patient chart against her chest. Her name tag hung askew, standard for a night shift nurse 3 hours into consciousness. She'd heard every word. The room knew it immediately because the laughter didn't just stop, it reversed, became the kind of silence that only happens when someone has witnessed something they can't immediately reconcile with their self-image. Natalie took one measured breath. The kind of breath that empties everything unnecessary from your lungs before you move. She walked to Hargrove's chair. The leather creaked under her shoes. She placed the chart on the table in front of him. Her hands were absolutely steady. Her voice, when it came, sounded like it was coming from somewhere very far away, somewhere quiet and still. "Your patient in Bay 3, she said. "The one I just kept from coding during the night shift." A single tear escaped down her cheek. She didn't close her eyes. Didn't look away. She wiped it with the back of her hand without flinching, the motion economical and final, like closing a book. "He's ready for morning rounds." She turned and walked out. The door hissed closed behind her. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The fluorescent lights buzzed in the silence like insects trapped in glass. Hargrove's face had gone the particular shade of red that happens when a man realizes his audience has just shifted sides without asking permission. 3 days later, it was the cafeteria. 11:41 a.m. Natalie carried her lunch tray through the rows of tables, turkey sandwich, apple, bottle of water, the kind of meal that suggested someone eating out of obligation rather than appetite. Her scrubs were still damp from the overnight shift bleeding through a fresh set, she hadn't gone home yet. The hallway outside would have been empty, but she'd made the mistake of taking the direct route. Hargrove's table sat directly in her path. He was surrounded by 4 of his usual constellation, a cardiothoracic, 2 male nurses from the day shift, and a resident who was clearly trying to become part of something important. As Natalie approached, Hargrove extended his foot into the aisle. Casually. Like it was an accident waiting to happen. The tray left her hands before physics had fully registered what was happening. Turkey sandwich, apple, water bottle scattered across the tile floor like evidence of a crime. The sound of the plastic tray clattering echoed in the sudden quiet, that particular ringing noise that seems louder than it has any right to be. Laughter erupted. Not from Hargrove, he was watching her face. The laughter came from the people who needed permission to laugh, and he'd just given it to them by maintaining absolute composure. Natalie knelt. One measured breath. She picked up the sandwich first, then the apple. The water bottle had rolled under another table, she retrieved it without comment. Her movements were precise, methodical, the way someone picks up something that matters to no one. Around her, the cafeteria had begun to watch. 30 people. 40. The kind of audience that made this less a mistake and more a statement. She stood, the food in her hands, the tray balanced on one arm. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, doctor," she said. Her eyes met his. No anger visible. No hurt. Just statement of fact, delivered in a voice that sounded like someone reciting their own biography. She turned toward the trash and walked away, dumping the scattered lunch with the same efficiency she'd used to collect it. Behind her, Hargrove's smile had frozen on his face. The next afternoon, it was the emergency room. 3:15 p.m. during shift change, the exact moment when the day shift and night shift overlapped, when there were the maximum number of witnesses. Hargrove approached Natalie at the central station where she was documenting a patient assessment. He was holding a chart. His face was arranged in an expression that suggested he'd finally figured out how to regain control of the narrative. He dropped the chart at her feet. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. His voice was loud enough that 15 staff members froze. "That's what you're good for." The chart landed with a slap of paper against linoleum. Someone's phone buzzed. The monitor behind them beeped in steady rhythm, completely indifferent to social hierarchies. Natalie took one measured breath. One tear escaped. She wiped it without closing her eyes, without looking away from the screen in front of her. Then she bent down. Retrieved the chart. The movement was unhurried, economical, the way someone picks up something that belongs to them. She straightened, holding the chart against her chest the same way she'd been holding it when she walked into that lounge 3 days earlier. "When you're done performing," she said, "your patient is still waiting." Hargrove's face went the color of old brick. His hand moved toward his pocket phone. She'd seen men make that movement before. Not often. But she'd seen it. She walked away, carrying the chart, carrying the attention of every person in the emergency room, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Oak Creek Memorial 6 months ago, something shifted in the way people looked at her. It wasn't respect. Not yet. But it was no longer invisibility. Behind her, Hargrove pulled his phone from his pocket, his jaw working silently as he dialed. At 1:58 a.m., the ambulance bay doors crashed open like someone had finally lost patience with the world. The rotor wash from the incoming bird still shook the windows even after the Black Hawk had already passed overhead, heading back toward the military installation. Paramedics came first, moving with the controlled urgency of people who'd transported through enemy fire more than once. The patient came next. Late 30s, maybe 40. Male. Stab wound to the anterior left chest with the ragged edges that suggested a civilian blade rather than combat steel. Respiratory distress. Shallow breathing. Blood saturation dropping, the monitor showed O2 sat at 88 and falling. Purple Heart medal visible on the left shoulder of his jacket, partially torn in the same incident that had created the wound. His eyes were open but empty, the particular darkness that happened when the brain had decided the world was too dangerous to process properly. And he didn't speak. The paramedic's handoff report mentioned it twice. Patient is nonverbal, possible severe PTSD, found unresponsive behind the VA clinic at 1:33 a.m. Natalie took the report while they transferred him to the trauma bed. Cardiac monitor. O2 mask. 2 large bore 4s, 1 in each arm. She'd done this 1,000 times, her hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that belonged to someone whose nervous system had been trained by fields that civilians didn't have names for. But as his jacket shifted during the transfer, something under the lining caught her eye. A faded unit patch. Sewn into the jacket's interior. The same patch that was in her locker at home, the one she hadn't touched since she'd driven into Savannah 6 months ago and decided to become invisible. Her hands froze for exactly half a second. Then she continued. Because stopping was not an option. Stopping meant questions, and questions meant answers she wasn't prepared to give. She called for physician support while beginning her assessment. Blood pressure 92/55 and dropping. Heart rate 128, tachycardic. The stab wound was shallow but penetrating, pneumothorax possible, maybe even tension pneumothorax if the lung field was collapsed. She needed imaging. She needed a surgeon. She needed someone with authority and credentials and a name that meant something in this hospital. Dr. Chen arrived first, examined the patient, noted the communication difficulty, and said clearly, "I can't treat nonverbal PTSD cases without a psych consultation. It's protocol. I'm not comfortable with the liability." He left. 5 minutes later, Dr. Rodriguez came next. Looked at the wound. Looked at the patient's blank eyes. Said, "This is too complex. He needs someone specialized in trauma psychiatry, not just emergency medicine." "That's not me. Call someone fresh." Gone. For minutes. Dr. Kim came in at the end of her double shift, exhausted, and took one look at the situation before saying, "I cannot make clinical decisions when I'm operating on fumes. I'm going home. Get another attending." She didn't run, but her walking pace suggested she might have if hospital protocol allowed for it. 3 more came through. Each one found a different reason. Protocol. Liability. Specialization requirements. Comfort levels. The language changed, but the refusal remained constant. Then Dr. Hargrove arrived. He examined the patient with the efficiency of someone who was checking a box on a form. Looked at the wound. Listened to the breath sounds. Checked the monitor. Then he stepped back and said, loud enough for the entire trauma bay to hear, loud enough for the 3 nurses and resident who were watching to become witnesses, "This patient is a liability we can't afford. No physician coverage tonight. Hospital policy. He needs to be transferred to a facility with better psychiatric resources." 7 doctors. 7 refusals. Natalie stepped forward before her brain could calculate the consequences. "Then I'll treat him myself," she said. Her voice was steady as the monitor behind her. "And I'll document every refusal." Hargrove smiled. Cold. Satisfied. Like he'd finally caught her doing something he could use against her. "Be my guest, sweetheart," he said. "Your license. Your problem." He walked out. Natalie began the assessment, her hands moving with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory older than her nursing license. But as she repositioned the patient to examine his left side, his hospital gown shifted slightly, and what had been hidden became visible. Black ink on brown skin. Spelled across the forearm in military script, "Chief Hayes." Her blood froze. He had no idea who she was. No idea that the nurse's hands moving across his chest belonged to the operator who'd carried him through gunfire in Ramadi. No idea that the woman pulling on fresh gloves was the same person who'd left that unit 6 months ago and chosen to disappear rather than face another day in a world that demanded she be more than human. The ambulance bay doors crashed open at 2:07 a.m. Rain hammered the parking lot behind them. The stretcher came through fast, wheels squeaking against wet tile, and Natalie knew before she even saw the patient's face. The tattoo on his forearm caught the fluorescent light as the paramedics wheeled him past. 2 words in military block letters. Chief Hayes. Her name. Her rank. Her past walking through the doors of Oak Creek Memorial with a stab wound deep in his left chest and breathing that came in short, panic gasps like a drowning man pulled from black water. 8 years. 8 years since Ramadi. 8 years since she'd carried this man, Sergeant Marcus Webb, call sign Reaper, through gunfire to the extraction point while his lung was already failing from shrapnel. 8 years since she'd disappeared and chosen to become someone else entirely. And now he was here, unconscious, his purple heart visible on the jacket the paramedics had cut away from his shoulders, and he had no idea that the quiet nurse pulling on fresh nitrile gloves was the same operator who'd held his chest together in a sandstorm. The senior resident, Dr. Patel, met the stretcher at Trauma Bay 3. Natalie moved into position without being asked, muscle memory sliding her into the role she'd perfected over 6 months, invisible, competent, unnoticed. The vitals came through rapid fire. BP 118/72, dropping. Heart rate 132 and climbing. O2 sat 88 on room air. Respiratory rate 26. The wound was 2 inches left of the sternum, maybe a quarter inch from the left anterior descending artery. 2 millimeters in either direction, and this man would already be dead. What do we have? Dr. Patel stepped back from the stretcher, his face already shifting into that particular expression Natalie had learned to read. The expression of someone calculating whether a patient was worth the effort. Stab wound to anterior chest, the paramedic reported. Found him 20 minutes ago on River Street. Nonverbal, looks like bilateral scars on his neck, possible PTSD indicators. Full neuro exam difficult. Vitals have been stable during transport but trending down last 5 minutes. The word landed like a stone. Nonverbal. Dr. Patel stepped back from the stretcher. Get him stabilized and call neurology. I'm not comfortable with a patient I can't communicate with. We need psych consultation before we do anything invasive. He turned to walk away. Natalie's voice came out level. Stab wound to the anterior chest. We're talking potential hemopneumothorax. Neuro can wait. Patel didn't even look back. That's above your pay grade, Hayes. And he was gone, already moving toward the next bed, the next patient, the next problem that didn't require him to think too hard. 2 minutes later, Natalie paged the attending. Dr. Richardson came down from the cardiac unit, looked at the patient for 45 seconds, and shook his head. The complexity here is significant. I can't manage a nonverbal trauma patient with probable PTSD on top of a penetrating chest wound. What happens if he decompensates and I need to communicate about pain management? Risk is too high. Find someone else. Back to the elevator. Gone. The third doctor was faster. Dr. Martinez actually laughed, a short, tired laugh, when he glanced at the patient. I'm heading home after a double shift. I've been here since yesterday morning. Whatever this is, it's not my problem. The automatic doors hissed shut behind him at 2:23 a.m. For minutes of silence. Natalie was already running 2 liters of O2 into the patient's nostrils, already setting up a monitor, already doing the work that no one else wanted. Her hands moved with the calm of someone who'd done this before in a tent under mortar fire, in a Humvee with the bleeding happening faster than the driving, in 100 places where the only choice was to keep moving or watch someone die. Dr. Chen appeared at 2:31. He looked at the X-ray Natalie had already ordered, smart move, had it done, and pressed his lips together. I've got a double admission coming from the psych unit. Both of them are active cases. I don't have capacity for someone this complicated. Can someone else take him? He was already walking. He didn't wait for an answer. The clock on the trauma bay wall read 2:34 when Dr. Hargrove walked in. He moved with the kind of presence that made other people smaller, the kind of presence that came from knowing, with absolute certainty, that he was the smartest person in any room he entered. His white coat was pristine. His stethoscope had never actually been used to listen to a patient's heart. Natalie had learned that much in 6 months. He used it as a prop. He used it to signify authority in a way that actual medicine never could. He looked at Marcus Webb the way someone might look at a stain on an expensive carpet. This is a liability we can't afford, Hargrove said. His voice had the texture of gravel under expensive shoes. Nonverbal trauma patient. Probable PTSD. Stab wound. If he codes, what then? If he survives but has neurological complications, we get sued for inadequate informed consent because we can't verify he agreed to our treatment protocol. He turned to Natalie. Get a psychiatric hold on him. We'll stabilize basic vitals and admit to ICU under observation. He's not getting an emergency thoracotomy or anything invasive from my department. Not happening. Natalie felt the moment crystallize. 7 doctors. 7 refusals. 7 men who'd looked at this Marine and calculated him as too much work, too much risk, too much problem. "I'll treat him," Natalie said. Hargrove turned back to her slowly. The smile that crossed his face was the smile of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "You'll what?" "I'll take the case." Her voice stayed level. No inflection. No emotion bleeding through. Just a statement of fact. Full documentation of every refusal. Chart entries time-stamped. "I'll manage his vitals, monitoring, pain control, and surgical prep if needed." "You're a night shift nurse, Hayes." He said her name like it was something stuck between his teeth. "You have no authority to make clinical decisions. You'll stay in your lane or you'll be looking for another job by shift change." He leaned in closer. "And I've got friends in HR. They'll make sure you never work in Savannah again." Natalie didn't flinch. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough that he looked away first, and then she turned back to her patient. Behind her, she heard Hargrove's footsteps retreat toward the physician's lounge. She heard him tell the resident staff that Webb was under observation, not getting intervention, and that if anyone went against his directive, they'd be looking for new letters of recommendation. The room went quiet except for the ventilator's mechanical wheeze and the steady beep of the cardiac monitor. Natalie pulled up a chair. It was 2:41 a.m. She documented everything. Every refusal went into the patient record in meticulous detail, timestamps, exact words, reasons stated. The 4 lines she started herself. 2 18-gauge catheters because penetrating chest trauma meant she might need to move fast. She ran 2 liters of normal saline wide open, watching the BP stabilize slightly. 118/71. The O2 sat climbed to 92. She positioned him on his left side, better perfusion to the uninjured lung, and set up a second monitor just to watch the O2 levels minute by minute. The rhythm on the EKG was sinus tachycardia, regular, no ectopy. His heart was scared but steady. By hour 4, she'd started a third 4. By hour 5, she was checking his breath sounds every 20 minutes and writing down the results: left lung diminished, right lung clear. The asymmetry was increasing. The left side was getting quieter. Hour 6 came and went. It was 8:07 a.m. The day shift was arriving. The hallway outside the trauma bay was getting crowded with people changing out of the night, people heading toward the cafeteria, people who'd slept and eaten and had the kind of energy that only came from not spending 6 hours watching a man's oxygen saturation edge downward despite supplemental oxygen flowing into his lungs. His O2 was dropping. 89, 87. 85. Natalie paged the on-call physician. No response. She paged again. Nothing. She increased the oxygen to 3 liters. The sat climbed back to 90 and stayed there, fragile, temporary, like a hand barely grasping the edge of a cliff. Hour 12. Noon. His breathing had become labor, shallow, desperate, the kind of breathing that meant his body was already starting to fail. His left chest wall wasn't moving the same way as his right. The asymmetry had progressed. When she pressed her stethoscope against his ribs, the left side sounded like silence. Natalie called Hargrove. She found him in the physician's lounge, coffee steaming from a ceramic mug that said Chief of Emergency Medicine in gold lettering. The lounge smelled like burnt coffee and the kind of stale air that only came from rooms where no one ever opened a window. "I need physician support," Natalie said. Her voice hadn't changed. It was steady, professional, the voice of someone requesting a standard consultation. Patient is showing signs of developing tension pneumothorax. Left-sided breath sounds diminished, respiratory distress increasing, O2 sat dropping despite supplemental oxygen. Hargrove looked at her over the rim of his coffee cup. He took a slow sip. The moment stretched out like pulled taffy. "You said you'd handle it," he said finally. Handle it. He didn't look away from his coffee. Didn't acknowledge the reality of what was happening in the trauma bay. Just sat there in his pristine white coat with his unused stethoscope and told her to manage it herself. Natalie returned to the patient. Hour 16 came. Hour 18. His breathing had become a labor, in, out, each breath a small rebellion against a body that was quietly suffocating from the inside. His O2 sat was 78 now. 76, the supplement oxygen hissed through the nasal cannula, but it wasn't reaching anything anymore because his left lung wasn't accepting air at all. It was collapsing. Pressure building. Blood pushing toward his heart. Hour 20. 3:06 a.m. on the second morning. The patient's lips were turning blue. Not pale. Blue. The color of someone running out of oxygen. The color of someone dying in a hospital bed while 7 doctors refused to help and one night shift nurse documented everything with the clinical precision of someone who'd already lost too much in her life to let this man become another casualty. Natalie made her choice. She moved with the silence of someone who'd spent 8 years learning to become invisible. For port confirmed. Chlorhexidine scrub on his chest, cold, surgical, the smell of antiseptic cutting through the recycled hospital air. She identified the landmarks. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The exact same location where she'd performed this procedure 8 years ago on this exact man while sand was still falling from the sky like snow. The needle was 14 gauge. She felt the pop as it entered the pleural space, that distinctive tactile feedback of tissue giving way, and then the hiss. Oh God, the hiss. The sound of pressure releasing. 8 years ago it had been gunfire and screaming. Now it was the quiet hospital air and the machine's steady beep. The veteran gasped. Color flooded back into his lips. Pink. Real. Alive. His oxygen saturation jumped. 89, 92. 94, climbing. Sinus rhythm steady on the monitor. Breathing easier now, the fear draining out of his face as his lungs remembered what it felt like to pull oxygen into blood. Behind her, slow clapping started. Natalie didn't turn around. She was securing the needle with tape, checking the placement one more time, running through the checklist of what came next. But she knew that sound. She'd heard it before in her life, the sound of someone applauding something they planned to use as evidence. Hargrove stood with his phone in his hand. He was still recording. His smile was the smile of a man who'd just gotten exactly what he needed. Practicing medicine without a license, Hayes, he said softly. That's perfect. That's really perfect. 20 hours into her vigil, the monitors told a story Natalie's hands had learned to read 100 times before. The veteran's breathing had shifted, shallow, compensatory, the kind of desperation a body uses when one lung has decided to quit. She watched the oxygen saturation climb backward on the screen, 94, 92, 89. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical monotone overhead as she pressed 2 fingers to his radial artery. Thready. Rapid. The clinical word for panic was tachycardia, but Natalie had spent enough years in places where oxygen disappeared that she recognized what was happening, tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung. Air was filling his chest cavity like water filling a sinking compartment, and with every breath he took, more pressure built inside him, collapsing the other lung, pushing his heart sideways. She hit the code button. Nothing. She hit it again, and this time she moved into the hallway, her voice steady as surgical steel. Code. Trauma Bay 3. Now. The intercom crackled confirmation, but the ER remained exactly as it was, the night shift skeleton crew scattered across 6 beds, residents finishing charts, everyone suddenly too busy to run. 30 seconds passed. 40. The monitor's alarm wailed behind her like a siren drowning in concrete. Natalie stood at the intersection of 2 hallways, her hands already moving, already knowing. No physician was coming. The hallway was empty except for the fluorescent lights and the rhythm of her own breathing. She could wait. She could follow protocol. She could stand here and watch him die while her pager remained silent. She didn't wait. The emergency airway cart rolled at 3 miles per hour. Her hands opened the trauma pack with the precision of someone who had done this in humps and mud and darkness so complete you couldn't see your own palms. 14-gauge angiocath needle. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The anatomy was the same whether you were in a hospital or a combat zone, ribs, intercostal muscles, pleural space. Pain was information. Pain is data. She palpated the landmarks, felt the bones beneath the skin, and muscle memory took over, not thought, not hesitation, just the body doing what 17 years had taught it to do. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping was the most beautiful sound Natalie had heard in 6 months. The sigh of a lung being born again, oxygen flooding back into circulation, pressure releasing like a valve in a pipe. She could feel the veteran's body relax beneath her hands, the desperation leaving his muscles. 92%. 94. 96. Oxygen climbing like a rescue helicopter hauling someone out of water. The monitor's rhythm steadied. His heart rate dropped from 142 to 112, still elevated but no longer screaming. She maintained the needle position, counted her breaths with his, waited for the color to return to his lips. That was when she heard the boots. Dr. Hargrove appeared around the corner at a velocity that suggested he had been watching the whole thing from his office. His face was not angry. Anger would have been simpler. Anger Natalie could have weathered. What Natalie saw instead was something else entirely, the look of a man who had just been handed exactly what he needed. He stood in the hallway, 15 feet away, and let his eyes move from the needle in her hand to the veteran's chest to her face. 1 measured breath. 2. Then he turned and walked back toward his office without speaking a single word. What happened next took exactly 4 hours. The first call came at 7 in the morning. Hargrove had the hospital board president's private line, the kind of number you get only when you're tenured faculty with 30 years of institutional loyalty. She was at Eagle Point Country Club, mid-swing on the 14th hole, when her phone buzzed against her golf bag. Hargrove's voice was professional, measured, deeply concerned. A nurse had performed an invasive surgical procedure in the hallway without physician supervision, without proper sterile field, without any credential to justify the decision. A tension pneumothorax decompression. A procedure that belonged in a controlled environment, administered by trained hands, documented through proper channels. He had witnesses. He had the procedure note sheet entered into the system at 2:38 a.m., which was itself a violation, altering charts without physician oversight. The board president listened, asked 3 clarifying questions, and told Hargrove she would be back in the office by 10. The second call went to the state nursing board at 8:15. Hargrove's complaint was specific, damning, and technically accurate. A registered nurse had practiced medicine without a license, performed a procedure beyond the scope of registered nursing, and created false documentation. The nursing board took exactly 19 minutes to forward the complaint to Oak Creek Memorial's compliance officer with a flag for urgent review. 3 separate state codes cited. 5 separate violations listed. The language was clinical and absolute, practicing beyond scope of practice, endangering patient safety through inadequate training, falsifying medical records, failure to maintain proper chain of command in emergency situations. The third call brought in the outside medical examiner, a retired physician from Johns Hopkins who specialized in malpractice review. Hargrove wanted every chart Natalie had touched in the last 6 months audited. Every medication she'd verified, every vital sign she'd recorded, every notation she'd made. If there was one violation, there might be others. If she performed one unauthorized procedure, she might have been doing this for months. The medical examiner arrived at the hospital before lunch with a briefcase and the kind of institutional authority that made even Hargrove step aside. By noon, the call came for Natalie. HR, 2nd floor, bring nothing. She knew what that meant. The hallway to human resources passed directly through the main ER, and she knew Hargrove had requested it that way. Shift change was beginning, the day shift arriving, the night shift departing. 3 nurses, 2 residents, for residents in training, the charge nurse, 2 respiratory techs, and a pharmacy resident all watched as she walked past them. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The message was clear: she was being removed. She was the problem. She was the reason something had gone wrong. The security officer was waiting outside HR. Not walking beside her, not escorting her with any courtesy, waiting like a checkpoint. She sat in a small beige room with the HR director and a legal witness while they explained, with genuine sympathy, that the state nursing board had initiated an investigation, that the hospital could not expose itself to the liability of her continued presence, that this was not a reflection of her character but a necessary protection for the institution. Her badge was deactivated at the desk on the ground floor while nurses she'd worked beside for 6 months walked past without making eye contact. Her locker was emptied by security, the cardboard box containing 6 months of shift changes, the single family photo she'd kept at the back, the compression bandage she wore under her scrubs on days when the old fracture ached, and she was walked out through the main entrance during the peak of shift change. Hargrove stood just inside the glass doors, watching. Their eyes didn't meet. He didn't need them to. His message had been delivered in the language he understood best: removal, exposure, institutional humiliation, the kind of erasure that made a person disappear not physically but professionally, socially, completely. She drove 2 hours north to Beaufort National Cemetery in a downpour. The rain came sideways, the kind of intensity that suggested the sky had decided to empty itself completely. Natalie knelt in front of Marcus's headstone in mud that soaked through her jeans, her hands shaking not from cold but from the kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. She stayed there for 2 hours, rain streaming down her face, mixing with salt water, her voice barely audible above the percussion of the storm. "I failed again," she whispered to the engraved name. "I couldn't save anyone without destroying myself. I tried to hide from who we were, tried to heal in silence, but I can't be her anymore. I don't know how to be anyone else." The headstone offered no response. The rain continued. She sat there until darkness made the letters invisible, until her body had absorbed enough water that she could no longer distinguish rain from tears. The apartment was empty when she returned. Her son's 3 voicemails remained unheard on her phone, his voice moving from concern to anger to something worse: resignation. The kind of tone that comes when a child stops expecting a parent to show up. She sat on the bathroom floor in muddy clothes and stared at nothing. Outside, Savannah continued. Hospitals continued. The veteran continued breathing air that someone else had fought to give him. And Natalie Hayes, senior chief petty officer, the woman who had carried 4 men through 200 meters of gunfire, who held 2 Navy Crosses and a Silver Star, sat alone on a bathroom floor and whispered to a version of herself that no longer existed, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But that wasn't the worst part. The hospital board convened at 9 o'clock in the morning in the executive conference room on the 14th floor. 7 members arranged themselves around a mahogany table that gleamed like dark water. The CEO sat at the head. Legal counsel had 3 folders stacked in front of her. Rain hammered the windows overlooking Savannah's historic district, and the fluorescent overhead panels cast everything in clinical white light. Dr. Hargrove stood at the far end of the table with a presentation clicker in one hand and a leather portfolio in the other. He wore his white coat like armor. His voice carried the practiced confidence of a man who had never been contradicted in his own hospital. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes," he began, his tone measured and surgical, exceeded her scope of practice in direct violation of state nursing board regulations. At 02:47 hours on the morning of September 18th, she performed what amounts to an emergency surgical procedure, needle decompression, without physician authorization, without proper supervision, and without the patient consent documentation required by law. He clicked. A chart appeared on the screen behind him. Vital signs. Lab values. Timeline. All formatted to look damning. Furthermore, Hargrove continued, she directly countermanded my clinical decision regarding this patient. When I determined the patient was a liability to this institution given his psychiatric status and nonverbal presentation, she not only disregarded my directive but documented my refusal in a manner designed to embarrass my clinical judgment. This is insubordination of the first order. The board members took notes. The legal counsel's jaw tightened slightly. The CEO said nothing. "We have a duty to protect this hospital from litigation," Hargrove said, and he clicked again. A second chart. Nursing board complaints for scope violations can result in license suspension or revocation. I recommend we terminate her employment immediately and report the incident to the state licensing authority before she damages our credibility further. The room was perfectly silent except for the sound of rain against the glass and the hum of the ventilation system. The board president opened her mouth to respond. The conference room doors burst open. A 16-year-old boy stood in the doorway, rain-soaked and trembling, not from fear but from the kind of energy that comes from running 3 miles through a downpour. His shirt clung to his shoulders. Water dripped from his dark hair onto the carpet. In his hands he held a wooden shadow box, the kind that belonged in a marine's bedroom or a sailor's living room, glass-fronted, lined in felt, displaying medals arranged in perfect formation. "James," the CEO said, surprised. "How did you?" "I need you to hear this," James said. His voice carried a steadiness that didn't match his age. He stepped into the room, his wet shoes leaving prints on the hardwood floor. "My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, Navy Special Warfare." Hargrove's face went pale. Not red. Pale. Like someone had opened a door in the wall he thought was solid. James set the shadow box on the mahogany table directly in front of the board president. The medals caught the light, ribbons in navy blue and gold, the distinctive angles of military insignia, a purple heart with its violet ribbon unmistakable even to civilians. "For combat deployments," James said, and he turned to face the entire room. 3 tours to Iraq. 1 to Afghanistan. She's been shot. Blown up. She lost her best friend and her husband on their last deployment together, and she's been living in this city for 6 months trying to heal quietly. And she saved a Marine's life 2 days ago when 7 doctors refused to help him. The board member closest to the shadow box reached toward it with trembling hands. She lifted the service file that lay beneath the medals. Military issue. Official. The seal of the Department of Defense was visible even from across the table. She read aloud, her voice changing with each sentence, becoming smaller, more careful, "for combat deployments. Bronze Star recipient. Silver Star recipient. 2 Purple Hearts. Ramadi, Iraq. Sanjan Valley, Helmand Province. Classified Operation Clearance Level Top Secret SCI." The board president leaned forward to read over her shoulder. The legal counsel stood up. And then the doors opened again. The mute veteran rolled through in a wheelchair, his chest still bandaged beneath his shirt, his left arm in a sling. But his eyes were clear. They swept across the room and locked on Natalie's empty chair, the one meant for employees facing termination. Behind him came a man in his 60s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of bearing that made the air in the room seem to compress. Navy SEAL Commander. His uniform carried the insignia of 30 years of service and the quiet authority of someone who had seen every version of human capability and failure. "I'm Commander Thomas Reeves, Naval Special Warfare Group 1, the SEAL commander said. His voice was flat. Informational. Like he was reading a supply manifest. Senior Chief Hayes holds 2 Navy Crosses. A Silver Star. 3 Bronze Stars with Valor. She carried 4 men out of an ambush in Ramadi in 2008, including this Marine, under fire, across 500 meters of open terrain, with a gunshot wound to her left shoulder that she didn't report until all 4 men were on the extraction bird. He stepped beside the wheelchair. His hand rested on the veteran's shoulder, and the Marine's entire body relaxed under that touch. Recognition. The bond that comes from surviving impossible things together. That needle decompression she performed, the commander continued, was textbook field medicine. Military grade. She saved his life using equipment and knowledge she earned in the worst classroom on Earth. And she did it because 7 doctors, he paused, and his eyes moved across the table like a targeting system, refused to help a man who couldn't ask for help. The legal counsel sat back down slowly. The door opened a 3rd time. A man in his 50s, with a Marine Corps tattoo visible on the inside of his wrist, walked in carrying a laptop. Jake Morrison. IT Director. 15 years with the hospital. Combat veteran. His expression was the kind of calm that comes from having already made a decision he knew others wouldn't like. Dr. Hargrove, Morrison said, and he set the laptop on the table. At 3:47 a.m. on September 18, you entered the security office with a request to review footage related to an internal investigation. I was monitoring the backup systems. I watched you access the hallway camera archive. I watched you delete the recording of the needle decompression. Hargrove's face went from pale to the color of old paper. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The system automatically backs up to a remote server, Morrison continued, and he opened the laptop. The screen showed a timestamp. 3 hours 8 minutes and 13 seconds, every frame saved. Every action logged. I have here a complete video record of Senior Chief Hayes calling for physician support for Times. Of you intercepting pages to attending physicians. Of you blocking her access to medical staff. And of her saving that Marine's life with her own hands while the entire ER watched and documented it. Morrison turned the laptop so the board could see. He pressed play. The video was timestamp marked, crystal clear. Natalie in the hallway, her scrub soaked with the patient's blood and her own sweat, her hands moving with the precision of someone who had done this before, not in a hospital but in a place where precision meant the difference between living and dying. The needle going in. The hiss of air escaping. The veteran's oxygen saturation climbing on the portable monitor, 72. 78, 84. 91, normal breathing restored. I filed a formal report, Morrison said quietly, with the state medical examiner's office. Evidence tampering. Obstruction of patient care. Deliberate negligence resulting in patient endangerment. The state board takes that very seriously, Doctor. The legal counsel was writing notes in a furious script. The board president's expression had solidified into something that looked like anger. Professional anger. The kind that protects institutions and people who get things right. An FBI liaison stood from the back of the room, someone no one had noticed come in. She held credentials. Federal authority. Her voice was precise and cold. Her last mission is still classified at the highest levels, the liaison said. Senior Chief Hayes was offered a new identity option under the Federal Witness Security Program. She declined. She chose to disappear instead. To live anonymously. To heal in silence. The fact that she saved a service member while working as a nurse in a civilian hospital has triggered additional protocols, but those are between her and my agency. What I can tell this board is that she is not a liability. She is exactly the opposite. The liaison put her credentials away and stepped back. Hargrove tried to speak. His mouth moved. His hands gripped the edge of the table like he might fall otherwise. The board president cut him off before he could say a word. Her voice was not loud, but it filled the entire room like pressure behind glass. Dr. Hargrove, you are suspended immediately pending investigation. Security will escort you from the building. This board will be meeting with the state medical examiner and the hospital's legal team. You are to have no contact with staff, patients, or hospital systems. Do you understand me? Hargrove nodded. His hands released the table. He stood up, and for a moment he looked smaller than he had looked before, as if something had been removed from inside him. The authority. The assumed rightness of everything he did. It was gone. Morrison escorted him from the room. The veteran wheeled himself closer to the table, closer to where Natalie's file lay open. The board president picked up the service record and held it with both hands, reading the classified sections as if they made sense, as if any of them could possibly capture what those deployments actually meant. 2 weeks later, at the state medical board hearing, the 7 doctors who had refused the patient came forward one by one. Each one testified that Dr. Hargrove had explicitly told them the case was closed, that physician intervention was contraindicated, that the patient's psychiatric status made him unsuitable for aggressive treatment. Each testimony was recorded and filed. The mute veteran submitted a written statement, signed with a mark that James had witnessed. The medical examiner's report was 12 pages long and used the phrase gross negligence 3 times. 6 months after the hearing, Dr. Hargrove was teaching CPR to community college students in a building that smelled like industrial cleaner and microwave popcorn. Minimum wage. No benefits. No prestige. No one in that classroom knew he had once run an emergency department. No one cared about his credentials or his theories about liability. He was just the instructor, the one who made them practice chest compressions on a plastic dummy that didn't care if they got it right or wrong. On his last day at Oak Creek Memorial, as he cleaned out his office, he looked through the window toward the new veteran trauma program that had opened on the 3rd floor. He saw Natalie there, in professional attire now, standing at a podium during a dedication ceremony. The mute veteran sat in the front row, his eyes never leaving her. James was beside him, holding the wooden shadow box, the medals visible to everyone in the room. The unit patch, the faded one that had been sewn inside the veteran's jacket lining, the same patch Natalie had worn in Ramadi, hung in a frame on the wall behind her desk. 43 veterans came through the program in the first month. Natalie trained the ER staff on trauma care specific to service members. She taught them about nonverbal communication, about PTSD, about the way a combat veteran's nervous system can read a room for threats that civilian trauma doesn't teach you about. She still worked night shifts sometimes, by choice now, not hiding anymore. The last time she visited Marcus's grave, it was in sunshine. She knelt and touched the headstone, her hand steady and cool. "I found my way back," she whispered. "Not to who I was before, but to who we both were. James knows everything now. And that Marine I carried, he's helping me run the program. Some bonds really don't break." She placed a duplicate unit patch on the grave and stood. As she walked back to her car where James waited, the sun caught the insignia on the patch, and for a moment it glowed like proof that some things survive anything. Subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. What would you have done in Natalie's position? Drop a comment below. And if you know someone who's carried hidden heroism quietly through their life, share this video with them. Sometimes the bravest warriors don't carry guns. Sometimes they carry stethoscopes. Sometimes they carry silence and service and the unbreakable bonds of people who've seen the worst and choose to give the most anyway.